There's a silence in the great northern forests, a stillness so deep it feels like it's pressing down on you, a heavy, physical force in the frozen air. In the heart of deep winter, the world loses all color and sound. Everything becomes just the endless white of snow, the pale gray of the sky, and the heavy, smothering quiet. In this vast indifference, another kind of emptiness begins to grow, hunger. Not just the usual ache from missing a meal, but a deep, cellular-level starvation. A dull, gnawing void that eats away at your thoughts, your memories, and even your hope. It's a hunger so complete that the outside world begins to fade, and all that remains is the echoing emptiness inside you. As the body breaks down, the mind starts to shift. The laws of society, the ties of family, even the memory of love, they all start to feel like old stories from some distant, warmer world. The only thing that feels real is the cold, and the only God that exists now is hunger, a God that demands to be fed. And in this place of complete desperation, a question starts to drift through the wind, a question that civilization has long forgotten how to ask. When the last scrap of food is gone, when there's nothing left to hunt and nothing left to eat, what do you do? When the hunger gets so intense that the person lying next to you on this endless, frozen night is no longer your friend, no longer your family, but just meat, what ancient instinct stirs awake in the forest when that final line is crossed? The story of the Wendigo comes from a very specific place, a vast and ancient wilderness known as the Great North Woods. This is the boreal forest, a sweeping green belt that stretches across the northern edge of the continent. It's a primal world filled with pine and spruce, birch and tamarack, a land of 10,000 lakes and 1,000,000 frozen, silent rivers. It's a land of harsh, striking beauty, but it's not a gentle place. This isn't a landscape that gives easily or nurtures without effort. Its default state is cold, a deep, bone-penetrating cold that clings to the earth for more than half the year. Its silence doesn't bring peace. It feels more like it's watching, like a predator waiting to strike. For thousands of years, this forest has resisted human control. It's too cold, too dense, and its soil is too thin for large-scale farming. People didn't really live in it. They survived along its edges and in its shadow. It's a place you hunt in, a place you travel through, but not a place you ever truly conquer. For countless generations, this massive forest has been home to a great family of nations, the Algonquian-speaking peoples. From the Cree and Innu in the far north to the Anishinaabe near the Great Lakes and the Micmac in the east, they are a diverse people. But they all share a deep ancestral bond with this land and a powerful understanding of what it takes to live within it. Their lives followed the rhythm of the seasons. They were semi-nomadic hunters and gatherers, moving with the animal migrations and the ripening of berries. They didn't see the forest as an enemy to defeat, but as a living, breathing being, a powerful provider that gave everything needed to survive, but demanded care and respect in return. This relationship was central to their entire worldview. They didn't think of the world as a pile of resources for humans to use up. The world was alive. Every animal, every tree, every lake, every gust of wind, each one had its own spirit, its own will, and its own awareness. Humans weren't the rulers of this world. They were just one part of a huge, interconnected family made up of all kinds of non-human beings. To survive, you had to maintain a balanced, respectful relationship with all of them. That was the core law of the land. Show respect. Make offerings. Take only what you truly need. And never, ever let greed take over. Because if you broke those rules, if you disrespected the spirits or took too much, the spirits could punish you. And in the deep, merciless cold of the northern winter, breaking the greatest law of all could awaken the most terrifying spirit in the forest. But sometimes, no matter how much wisdom and skill and respect they had, the winter would stretch on too long. The caribou wouldn't return. The fish wouldn't come up through the ice. And the food that had been carefully stored would slowly run out. A family trapped inside their snow-covered lodge would begin to feel the world closing in. Hunger would grow into something more than discomfort. It would dig into their bones, dull their senses, and wear down their spirit. Days of hunger would turn into weeks. The cold outside would be matched only by the silence inside. This was the most dangerous moment, not just for the body, but for the mind. When every thought gets heavy with hunger, and even the memory of shared rules and sacred values starts to fade. When loneliness and suffering begin to blur the line between what's unthinkable and what's suddenly possible. For the Algonquian peoples, there was one line that could never be crossed, one law more sacred than all the rest. Never eat another person, no matter the cost. Breaking that taboo didn't just damage the body or the community. It tore something deep in the spirit. It brought a kind of corruption, a cold emptiness that could never be filled again. It was like answering a call from the frozen silence, a call that summoned something dark from the woods, something ancient, something always hungry. When the deep cold finally broke and the forest began to thaw, it was a relief for most, a return to life. But for a community that had lost people to the long dark, or for a lone survivor who emerged from a season of silence, spring could bring a new kind of fear, a quiet, creeping dread that came with the morning mist. Unspoken questions would hang in the air. How did this one person survive when the others didn't? Why do their eyes look so strange and hollow now? Why do they sit apart so quiet? The community would watch. They'd wonder. They'd fear what unspeakable choices might have been made during that long, bitter winter. Because the deepest fear wasn't just about what had already happened. It was about what might come next. The belief was that once a person crossed that sacred line, they were forever changed. That doing something so unnatural awakened a craving that would never go away. The physical hunger might have ended when spring came, but the spiritual hunger, once awakened, would stay. The survivor was now marked, a vessel for a hunger that could return at any moment. This lasting corruption, this spiritual hunger that came from breaking a sacred taboo, was known by many names across the wide Algonquian world. To the Cree peoples of the subarctic plains and forests, it was called the Wetiko. To their southern neighbors, the Anishinaabe of the Great Lakes, it was known as the Wendigo. Other nations had different names for it, each a variation on the same chilling idea: an evil spirit, a monster, a cannibal. Above all, this being wasn't seen as just some physical beast that could be tracked or hunted. It was a powerful, bodiless spirit, the embodiment of winter itself, the cold, the emptiness, and the relentless hunger that define the season. People said it rode the icy winds, whispering across the snow-covered land in search of a weak soul to inhabit. This spirit could infect someone almost like a disease of the soul. Someone isolated and starving was at risk, but so was anyone greedy or selfish, someone who hoarded supplies from their community. The spirit could slip in through a dream or be drawn to a heart already darkened by selfishness. Its goal was to find a human host, a body through which it could feed its terrible cravings. Once the spirit took hold, it would start consuming the person from the inside. The old stories say it devoured their soul and replaced their heart with a shard of ice. That person, who they were, was gone. Their body became just a shell, a walking corpse controlled by a single, overwhelming hunger that wasn't even theirs. A hunger for human flesh that never ended. Even though the Wendigo was a spirit first, it would change the host's body in horrifying ways. The person would grow, becoming freakishly tall, towering over normal people. But the bigger it got, the weaker it seemed. The creature looked more like a corpse than a giant. Its flesh appeared to rot from the inside out, leaving behind skin stretched thin over sharp bones, a sickly gray color like death. This strange form was a symbol of the curse itself. The creature's towering size showed how massive its hunger had become, but its skeletal frame revealed the truth that no amount of food could satisfy it. The more it ate, the bigger it got. The bigger it got, the hungrier it became. It was a living symbol of endless, consuming desire. Stories about its appearance are especially disturbing. Its sunken eyes were said to glow with a cold, animal-like light. Its hands and feet were sometimes described as tipped with long, jagged claws. And maybe worst of all, many traditions said it had no lips, as if in its madness it had chewed them off, its long, yellow teeth always showing. Sometimes, a heartbreaking detail was added, a scrap of a familiar shirt still hanging from its bones, or a lock of hair that had once belonged to someone loved. A haunting reminder that this creature wasn't born a monster. It was made, created in a moment of pure desperation when a person chose to break the most sacred rule. The creature that came from that possession wasn't just a mindless giant. It was a supernatural predator, freakishly fast and strong, able to run like the wind and shrug off the cold as if it wasn't even there. Some stories say it could mimic voices, crying like a baby or calling someone's name, tricking its victims into stepping out of safety and into the dark. Everything it could do served one purpose: to find its next meal. Once transformed, the human mind was gone. It was replaced entirely by the spirit's endless hunger. No more reason, no more sympathy, no memory of love or community. It would hunt down its own former friends and family without hesitation, no longer seeing them as people, just as food, just a way to quiet the gnawing void inside, even if only for a moment. And this is the true horror at the heart of the Wendigo, that its hunger is completely insatiable. The more it eats, the bigger it gets. And the bigger it gets, the deeper its starvation becomes. Every meal brings no relief. Just a short pause before the craving comes back even worse. It is gluttony and starvation in one, made into a living creature. No amount of food from the outside world can fill the emptiness inside. The Wendigo is locked in an eternal state of self-destruction. Its chewed-away lips are just the beginning. It is a being at war with itself, a black hole of hunger that can never be filled. A spirit so consumed by need that its final fate is to devour itself, but only after it's devoured everything and everyone around it. But the most profound change in a person possessed by the Wendigo wasn't something you could see. Across many Algonquian nations, the teachings agree on one core spiritual truth. The spirit would eat the person's human heart and grow a lump of jagged ice in its place. This frozen heart wasn't just the creature's power source. It was the heart of the curse itself. The ice heart made the Wendigo immune to the worst cold of winter. But more importantly, it stood as a symbol, a powerful metaphor for the complete loss of humanity. No empathy, no warmth, no love, just a cold, empty ache that nothing could soothe. This spiritual weakness was also the key to killing the Wendigo. Because it was a supernatural being, ordinary weapons usually didn't work. Arrows and bullets were said to be useless unless wielded by a powerful shaman. The only real way to destroy it was to destroy its frozen heart. According to tradition, once the Wendigo was killed, its body had to be carefully taken apart. The icy lump had to be cut from its chest and melted completely in the flames of a sacred fire. Not a single shard could be left. Only then, when the body, the vessel of its evil, was fully destroyed, would the spirit finally leave this world, breaking its icy grip at last. But the Wendigo story was never only about starvation or cannibalism. It was always much bigger, a powerful cultural warning about something deeper. Greed. Someone who hoarded food while others went without. A leader who chose personal power over the good of the people. A merchant who cheated others for profit. All of them were said to act like a Wendigo. In a culture where survival depended on mutual help and sharing, selfishness wasn't just a flaw. It was a danger to everyone. The Wendigo was a nightmare made real, a supernatural warning of what happens when a person forgets their responsibilities to others and starts living only for their own never-ending appetite. And this is where the myth becomes timeless and deeply relevant. The Wendigo isn't just some ancient forest monster. It's a symbol of bottomless consumption, a spiritual sickness that makes us crave more and more, far beyond what we actually need. A hunger for power, for wealth, for resources. The kind of craving that eats a person from the inside out. The Wendigo story warns us that the worst monsters don't always come from the outside. Sometimes they come from the frozen, empty spaces inside our own desires. In a world understood to be alive with powerful spirits, some helpful, others hostile, every community needed a specialist, someone who could navigate the complicated and often dangerous realm of the spirit world. This vital figure, a person of immense power, deep training, and great respect, was the shaman. A shaman was far more than just a healer. They were the community's psychologist, prophet, and spiritual ambassador. They treated illness by identifying its spiritual root. They interpreted dreams to foresee the future. And they negotiated with the spirits of animals to ensure successful hunts. Their most essential role was keeping the delicate balance between the human world and the spirit world. Their power came from a rare ability, developed over years of disciplined training, the ability to enter a deep trance and send their own spirit out of their body. During these soul journeys, they could travel through the spirit world, meet cosmic powers, confront hostile entities, and recover lost souls. This made them the only ones capable of truly fighting a Wendigo. Because the Wendigo was, above all, a spiritual threat, it couldn't be defeated by physical force alone. It had to be confronted on its own ground, the spiritual plane. Only a shaman, a warrior who could walk in both worlds, had the training and strength to face the Wendigo spirit head-on and stand a chance of defeating it. The first battle against a Wendigo often didn't happen in the physical world. It started in the mind. In many Algonquian cultures, dreams weren't just random stories. They were meaningful. Dreams were a direct connection to the spirit world, a place where humans received guidance, warnings, and prophecies. A powerful or repeated dream was taken very seriously. If someone in the community began having certain nightmares, being lost in an endless winter storm, seeing a tall, skeletal figure moving among the trees, or, most frightening of all, dreaming about eating human flesh, it was seen as a powerful spiritual alarm. It meant the Wendigo spirit had noticed that person and was trying to gain a foothold in their soul. The afflicted person would seek out the shaman for a diagnosis. They'd describe the dream in detail, and the shaman would use divination to interpret it. By entering a trance, the shaman could identify the spirit behind the dream and determine how strong its influence was. This was a critical moment. If the shaman confirmed that the Wendigo spirit was trying to possess the person, the community had to act immediately. A spiritual war had to begin before the spirit could take hold, before the heart turned to ice and the hunger became unstoppable. That dream was the first warning shot in a battle for a human soul. When a community faced a serious spiritual threat, like a possible Wendigo possession, the shaman might perform one of the most dramatic and powerful ceremonies in the Algonquian world, the rite of the shaking tent. A special lodge was built for this ceremony, a small, narrow, barrel-shaped structure meant to be a temporary vessel for intense spiritual power, a doorway between worlds. The shaman would crawl inside, often after being tightly bound with ropes by community members to prove that what would happen next was not a trick. The people would gather outside in silence, waiting in the dark. They wouldn't see what happened inside, but they would hear it. From within the darkness, the shaman would start chanting, calling on their spirit helpers. Soon, the people outside would hear strange sounds from the lodge, animal cries, whispers, and then voices, each with its own tone and personality. These were the voices of spirits crossing over from the other world. As more arrived, the entire tent would begin to shake and sway violently, like it was caught in a storm, pushed to its limits by the overwhelming energy of the spirits inside. This was a direct meeting with the spirit world. Members of the community could ask questions, and the spirits would answer through the shaking tent. In the case of a suspected Wendigo, this was the ultimate diagnostic tool. The shaman would ask the spirits to confirm the evil presence, measure its power, and share the sacred knowledge needed to drive it out. In a time of fear and uncertainty, this was how they got answers. If the shaman confirmed that the Wendigo spirit was taking hold, but before the person had committed any violent acts, there was still time to save them. The community would watch the person carefully. They'd become withdrawn, antisocial, and quiet. They'd refuse to eat normal food. They'd often complain about a cold they couldn't shake, a physical sign of the ice forming in their heart. This was known as Wendigo sickness, and it was a race against time. The community knew that if the spirit wasn't cast out, it would eventually consume the person's humanity. That once quiet patient would become a violent, unrecognizable monster. A desperate cure had to be attempted. The most widely recorded treatment, and the most shocking to modern ears, was to force feed the person, not with meat or broth, but with hot, rendered animal fat. Spoon after spoon of hot grease or tallow was given to them, sometimes by forcing a hardened stick of fat down their throat. As strange as it may sound, the reasoning was deeply spiritual. The Wendigo was a creature of cold. Its spirit and heart were made of ice. So to fight it, they needed heat and fat, the most concentrated forms of energy and warmth. The goal was to melt the frozen heart, forcing the person to vomit up the evil spirit and break its icy hold. But sometimes the cure failed, or the person wasn't found until they had already given in to the hunger and hurt others. In those tragic cases, the person was believed to be beyond saving. Their human soul was gone, fully devoured by the spirit. They were no longer a sick loved one. They were a Wendigo, a threat to every living thing around them. When that happened, the community, often led by the shaman, had a terrible final task. The creature had to be destroyed. This wasn't revenge. It was protection. The Wendigo would be ritually executed, sometimes with a silver bullet, or by beheading, always to disable the body. so the real work could begin. Because killing the physical form wasn't enough. The body was still the spirit's vessel. If it wasn't completely destroyed, the Wendigo could rise again, or its spirit could leap to a new host. So the body had to be taken apart. The frozen heart had to be carved from the chest. These pieces were then burned in a massive funeral pyre. The fire was kept burning, sometimes for days, until every trace, especially the icy heart, was turned to ash. Only then, through this final fiery rite of purification, could the community be sure the spirit was gone, and that they were finally safe from the unnatural hunger that haunted the winter winds. In this ancient world filled with spirits and shamans, a new kind of man began to arrive in the 17th century. They came from across the vast ocean, from the refined cities of France. These men were deeply religious and highly educated, members of the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, known to indigenous peoples as the Black Robes. They left behind everything they knew, willingly stepping into what they believed was a savage and godless wilderness. Their mission was clear and unwavering: to bring the light of the Christian God to the native peoples of North America. They saw indigenous communities as living in spiritual darkness, their lives and beliefs governed not by God, but by the devil and his demons. These missionaries were prepared to face unimaginable hardships, starvation, disease, and even death, all for the sake of saving souls. As these educated Europeans lived among the Algonquian tribes, they began carefully documenting the customs, languages, and beliefs they observed. They became some of the first ethnographers of the New World. But their records weren't created with the open curiosity of anthropologists. They wrote with the judgmental eye of theologians. In their minds, they were mapping the kingdom of Satan. It's in their detailed journals, their relations, sent back to France, that we find the very first written accounts of the terrifying spirit that their new converts so deeply feared, the Wendigo. When the Jesuits heard the chilling stories of a cannibalistic spirit that could possess people and drive them to madness, they didn't dismiss them as superstition. They believed they were hearing real eyewitness reports of a supernatural evil at work. But they interpreted this evil through the only framework they had, their deeply rooted Catholic faith. To them, the Wendigo wasn't a nature spirit born from winter and starvation. It was a demon, a fallen angel, a servant of Satan, preying on the souls of a people who lacked the protection of true faith. To the Jesuits, a shaman's shaking tent ceremony wasn't a spiritual consultation. It was witchcraft. The Wendigo itself was a devil who had claimed the northern forests as its personal domain. And if the Wendigo was a demon, then the solution wasn't a shaman's rattle or ritual fire. The solution was the power of Christ. Jesuit writings describe confrontations with the Wendigo spirit, raising the cross against it, performing exorcisms to cast the demon out of its victims. They saw themselves as soldiers in a spiritual war, battling an actual devil for the future of the continent. Their journals offer a fascinating, though heavily biased, record of this intense clash of faiths. The Jesuit relations Those journals sent back to Europe are full of this struggle, a constant effort to force Algonquian beliefs into the mold of Christian demonology. These priests were brilliant and devoted men, but they were still men of their time, locked into the absolute certainty of their own worldview. They could listen to the stories, they could write down the words, but they couldn't truly grasp the belief system behind them, a world alive with spirits that weren't angels or demons, a monster not born from sin, but from desperation, and a violation of nature's balance. Their theology had no room for ideas like these. So, the first written records of the Wendigo are both valuable and limited. They preserve crucial details about the legend, but everything is filtered through profound cultural and spiritual misunderstanding. The Jesuits gave us the story, but they missed the meaning. To them, the Wendigo was just another monster in a world full of devils. But to the people who believed in it, the Wendigo was something far more, a sacred warning, a symbol of how fragile the human mind can be, and a chilling reminder of the darkness that lives inside the human heart. Our story now shifts from the realm of myth and second-hand accounts to a specific, documented, and deeply disturbing case. It's the late 1870s, across the vast plains and forests of what is now Alberta, Canada, and our focus is a man from the Cree Nation named Cutchin, known to authorities and traders simply as Swift Runner. He wasn't an outcast or a man feared by his community. In fact, by all accounts, Swift Runner was a well-known and highly respected figure. He was tall and powerfully built, known for his skill as a hunter and trapper, and for his calm and dependable nature. He was a man who moved confidently between two worlds, the traditional world of his own people and the new world of European settlers, traders, and lawmen. His talents made him especially valuable to the authorities of the expanding Canadian territory. He worked as a trusted guide for both the Hudson's Bay Company and the newly formed Northwest Mounted Police. Leading their patrols through the harsh wilderness, he knew better than most. Settlers saw him as a model of successful cooperation, a peaceful, reliable man. But this was a time of catastrophic change for the Cree. The great buffalo herds, the backbone of their culture and survival, had been hunted nearly to extinction by settlers and hide hunters. That ecological disaster was made worse by Canadian government policies that aimed to force nomadic peoples onto newly established reservations, often by withholding food aid. It was an era marked by widespread famine, disease, and cultural collapse, a world turned upside down by colonial expansion. It was in the middle of this desperation that Swift Runner prepared for a journey in the fall of 1878. This was no longer a routine trapping expedition. It was a desperate gamble, a last-ditch effort to find food for his family deep in the wilderness, far from the starving plains. He was joined by his wife, his 6 children, his mother-in-law, and his brother. Together, the family traveled deep into the northern forest, hoping to find a safe refuge where game might still remain. As the first snow began to fall, They vanished from the outside world, leaving behind a society in collapse to face the long winter on their own. The winter of 1878 was harsh and relentless. Snow piled high, covering the forest in a deep, isolating silence. For Swift Runner and his family, their small winter camp became their entire world, a tiny human outpost in a frozen ocean of trees. Weeks turned into months. The winter grew darker, colder, and more severe. They were hundreds of miles from the nearest trading post, mission, or settlement. In that remote place, there was no one to witness their struggle if the hunt failed, no one to help if sickness struck. The only authority was the brutal law of winter, and the only witness, the silent forest. Eventually, the great cold broke. Ice cracked on the rivers, and the geese returned north. Across the region, trappers and hunters began heading back to settlements and trading posts with their furs. But as the weeks of spring passed, Swift Runner and his large family were nowhere to be seen. At first, this wasn't too unusual, but as more time went by, quiet concern spread among traders and police. It was not like such an experienced man to be this late. Then, in late spring of 1879, he appeared. Swift Runner stumbled out of the wilderness and into the Catholic mission near the town of St. Albert. He looked like a shadow of the man who had left the previous fall, not physically, as his body still seemed strong, but something in his eyes had changed. They were wild and haunted. The confident gaze of the trusted guide was gone, replaced by a deep, terrible trauma. When the priests asked where his family was, Swift Runner broke down. He told them a tragic, harrowing story. The winter had been brutal, he said. The game had vanished. Starvation had come. One by one, he claimed his wife, his children, his mother-in-law, and his brother had died from sickness and hunger, leaving him the lone survivor of a terrible tragedy. At first, the priests responded with sympathy. The story was horrific, but not unbelievable. Northern winters were notoriously cruel, and tales of entire families perishing from hunger or illness were sadly common. They gave him food and shelter and listened as he shared his grief. But as days passed, the priests, and eventually officers from the Northwest Mounted Police who took his statement, began to notice something strange. For a man who claimed to have starved all winter, Swift Runner looked unusually healthy. He wasn't thin or frail. He was strong, too strong. That one detail didn't fit. Real survivors of such winters were usually skeletal, barely clinging to life. But Swift Runner's body was a silent contradiction, suggesting his story might be incomplete or worse, a lie. His haunted eyes said trauma, but his strong body said something else entirely. The suspicion deepened as other Cree hunters and trappers returned from their own winter camps. They all told the same story. Yes, it had been cold, but not extraordinarily so. Game had not disappeared. There had been no widespread famine. A hunter as skilled as Swift Runner should not have lost his entire family to starvation. Then came the most chilling testimony. Before leaving, Swift Runner's mother-in-law had confided in friends, saying she feared her son-in-law and had a bad feeling something terrible might happen. That, paired with Swift Runner's disturbing physical condition and contradicting accounts, was enough. The Northwest Mounted Police decided to investigate. They formed a patrol and asked Swift Runner to guide them back to his winter camp, the site of the supposed tragedy. Reluctantly, he agreed. The journey was long and tense. The expert guide, who once confidently led patrols through the wilderness, was gone. In his place was a silent, withdrawn man who seemed to be walking toward his own fate. He often stopped, claiming he had forgotten the way, needing to be pushed forward by increasingly wary officers. When they finally reached the camp, what they found was deeply unsettling. It was quiet, too quiet. They found a small camp and a crude lodge, but for a place where 8 people were said to have died, something was missing: graves. There was no sign anyone had been buried. As officers searched the area, a grim reality began to unfold. They found human bones scattered in the snow, picked clean. Many had been cracked open, clearly to extract the marrow. The officers, seasoned men of the wilderness, knew these were not animal bones. Inside the lodge, the true horror was revealed. They found more human remains. A cooking pot still filled with rendered human fat. A small moccasin that belonged to Swift Runner's youngest child. The evidence was undeniable, gruesome, and worse than they had imagined. Swift Runner's story of tragic starvation had been a lie. This wasn't a scene of deprivation. In the camp's food cache, officers found dried meat and other supplies still intact. This was a site of slaughter, a place where one man had killed and eaten his own family. The long mystery of the silent winter had finally been solved, and the killer was Swift Runner. With the gruesome evidence discovered, he was arrested and charged with murdering his entire family and committing cannibalism. He didn't resist. The traumatized, wild-eyed act he had shown at the mission disappeared, replaced by a strange calm, as if a heavy burden had been lifted. He was taken to Fort Saskatchewan to await what would become a landmark trial. The trial of Swift Runner was one of the first times Canadian law was formally applied in the remote Western Territories. It marked a powerful clash of worlds. A British-style court, with its robed judge, white jury, and strict rules of evidence, now sitting in judgment over a case rooted in the deepest spiritual laws of the northern forest. Confronted with the overwhelming evidence, Swift Runner didn't deny anything. To the court's shock, he confessed to every detail. But his explanation was something the court wasn't prepared to hear. He didn't claim insanity, not in any way the law could understand. He said he wasn't responsible. He claimed he had been possessed. He told the court a Wendigo spirit had entered him during the dark heart of winter, that it had put ice in his heart and filled him with a terrible, unrelenting hunger. With unsettling calm, he described how the spirit, using his body, turned on his family. He wasn't a murderer, he insisted. He was the last victim, the only one whose body had survived. Of course, Canadian law had no place for demonic possession or evil spirits from the forest. To the judge and jury, it was simply a confession to human crimes. But to the Cree who followed the trial, his words meant something different. They believed they were hearing a first-hand account of a man who had truly lost the battle for his soul. Unsurprisingly, Swift Runner was found guilty. He was sentenced to be publicly hanged at Fort Saskatchewan. In the weeks before his execution, he remained calm, still insisting he was not a murderer, that the Wendigo spirit was the true killer, and his death would finally free him. He refused the comfort of Christian priests. Instead, he asked for a final feast shared with his people. He wanted them to witness his death, not to see punishment, but to be sure that the monster that destroyed his family would finally be gone. On the cold morning of December 20th, 1879, a crowd gathered for the execution. For Canadian officials, this was a show of authority, proof that law and order had reached the wilderness. But for the Cree witnesses, it was something very different. A public ritual to destroy a malevolent spirit. Historical accounts say Swift Runner remained calm until the very end. As the hangman tried to place the black hood over his head, something changed. He began to resist. He fought the guards with shocking strength. A guttural, inhuman scream tore from his throat, a sound that chilled everyone who heard it. To Canadian authorities, it was the final outburst of a desperate killer. But to the Cree, it was something else. In that terrible cry, they didn't see Swift Runner. They saw the Wendigo cornered and raging to the very end. As more cases like Swift Runners came to light, and as the world entered the more scientific era of the late 1800s and early 1900s, a different explanation for the phenomenon started to surface. Western doctors and early anthropologists weren't satisfied with the shaman's supernatural explanations or the court's simple criminal rulings. They wanted a logical reason behind these horrifying events. They suggested that the Wendigo wasn't some outside spirit possessing a person, but rather something inside them, a mental illness. They argued that the intense psychological stress caused by long-term starvation, freezing cold, and complete isolation could trigger a severe and terrifying mental breakdown, something similar to psychosis. In this theory, the intense craving for human flesh was a delusion, just a symptom of the mental illness. And the belief in a monster called the Wendigo was a cultural framework, a way for the person to make sense of their horrific and unimaginable urges. It was easier to believe that a monster had taken over than to accept that such a disturbing desire had come from within. The monster, according to this theory, was real, but it lived in the human mind. After these early psychological theories, a new wave of researchers headed into the field in the early 20th century to study the Wendigo directly. Anthropologists and folklorists visited remote Algonquian communities, carrying notebooks and old-school wax cylinder recorders. They talked to elders, gathered stories, and documented every version of the belief they could find. Their goal was to build a full scientific record of what they saw as a fading superstition. They studied the myth the same way a biologist might study a new animal. They broke it down into pieces, common story elements, possible social purposes, and likely psychological triggers. The terrifying forest spirit was slowly being turned into data, something to be labeled, classified, and stored in a university archive. And while this academic lens helped preserve the folklore, it also stripped the myth of its spiritual power. It pulled the Wendigo out of the snow-covered forests and out of the emotional world of fear and belief, and put it under cold lab lights and classroom projectors. The spirit was no longer a real danger to be defeated by a shaman. It became a specimen, an interesting detail in the study of so-called primitive cultures. Eventually, this scientific push led to a new and well-known diagnosis: Wendigo psychosis. For much of the 20th century, this was considered a textbook case of what experts call a culture-bound syndrome. A culture-bound syndrome is a mental disorder where the symptoms are shaped by cultural stories and beliefs. The root issues, like trauma, anxiety, or depression, might be the same across the world, but how they show up depends on the culture. In one place, someone might believe they're possessed by a demon. Somewhere else, they might think they're turning into a wolf. And in the northern forests of North America, a person might believe they're becoming a Wendigo. This theory gave scientists a clean and logical way to explain the whole thing. The spirit was a hallucination, the transformation was just a symptom, and the gruesome cannibalism was the tragic result of a rare but understandable mental illness. For the academic world, the mystery was solved. The Wendigo wasn't a real spirit to fear. It was a mental condition to be studied and recorded. This explanation fit neatly into the scientific worldview of the time. It allowed researchers to understand the phenomenon without having to believe in monsters or spirits. For many, the case was closed, but not for everyone. Many Algonquian people and others felt this explanation was missing something. Sure, it described how someone might break under pressure, but it didn't explain why their mind would break in such a horrifying and specific way. Couldn't an evil spirit be what caused the breakdown in the first place? Maybe the starvation and trauma weren't the illness, but the doorway the ancient spirit used to enter. So the question still hangs between two possibilities. Was the Wendigo just a mental illness shaped by cultural beliefs? Or was it a real spirit that caused the mind to unravel? Or maybe they're both just two ways of understanding the same terrifying reality. Science had given its answer, but as belief in the Wendigo faded from everyday life and began to live on through stories and fiction, its true nature became even more mysterious and harder than ever to pin down. As the 20th century moved forward, the world that had given birth to the Wendigo began to change permanently. The traditional, semi-nomadic way of life for many Algonquian communities was disrupted. The harsh, isolated winter hunts that once defined their survival became less and less common. With those massive social changes, the once very real threat of starvation, which had always fueled belief in the Wendigo, began to fade. And with that, the Wendigo itself, as a real cultural fear, started to slip into memory. But while the spirit was disappearing from the real world, it was quietly starting a strange new life on the written page. The stories that had been carefully recorded by Jesuit missionaries and anthropologists were now sitting undisturbed in university archives and libraries, just waiting to be found by a new kind of shaman. Not a healer or a spiritual leader, but a fiction writer. These writers weren't focused on the deep cultural warnings about greed or the original spiritual meaning of the creature. They were on the hunt for a good monster, something fresh and terrifying to stalk the woods in their stories of the supernatural and the unknown. And in the Wendigo, they found exactly what they needed: a name dripping with ancient menace, and a myth tied to cannibalism and madness. They took that name and borrowed a few of the creature's traits, but they left behind most of its cultural essence. The most important and influential story to reshape how the world sees the Wendigo was written in 1910 by English author Algernon Blackwood, a master of weird fiction. His novella, simply titled The Wendigo, took inspiration from the old anthropological records he had studied. He used familiar elements: a hunting party deep in the Canadian wilderness, an eerie presence lurking in the forest, and a native guide who knows far more than he's willing to admit, and turned them into a haunting piece of psychological horror. But Blackwood's Wendigo was a major departure from the traditional legend. It wasn't a spirit of cannibalism born from human sin or desperation. It was something much stranger. In his version, the Wendigo was a vast elemental force, an aerial being that lived high in the atmosphere and would sometimes descend, snatching an unlucky soul from their camp and dragging them screaming through the treetops at unbelievable speed. His victim didn't crave human flesh. Instead, their feet were burned down to stumps by the supernatural velocity of their flight, and their mind was completely shattered by a fleeting glimpse of a vast, cold, and uncaring universe. With that story, the horror of the Wendigo changed. It was no longer a moral warning about the darkness inside us. It became a cosmic horror story about how small and meaningless we are in the face of an ancient, unknowable world. This powerful literary shift would go on to influence almost every version of the Wendigo myth that followed. Blackwood's story made a lasting impression on other writers in the growing world of weird fiction, especially those in the circle around horror legend H.P. Lovecraft. These authors were fascinated by the idea of a prehuman, ancient being stalking the North American wilderness, and they saw it as a perfect addition to their shared universe of horrors. Lovecraft's close friend and fellow writer, August Derleth, eventually adopted Blackwood's version of the Wendigo into the Cthulhu mythos, a fictional universe filled with terrifying cosmic gods. He renamed the creature Ithaqua, the Wind Walker, and officially classified it as a Great Old One, a powerful alien entity from beyond time. At this point, the Wendigo was no longer the spirit of starvation that had haunted Algonquian stories. It had become something else entirely, a cosmic monster in a fictional pantheon of ancient gods. Its transformation from sacred folklore to horror fiction icon was nearly complete. By the middle of the 20th century, the Wendigo's journey into modern fiction was done. It had been fully separated from its original cultural roots and the complex moral lessons that had once defined it. The name Wendigo had turned into a recognizable piece of horror vocabulary. It was now a go-to symbol for something terrifying in the woods, a monster authors could use to frighten their characters and their readers alike. It became a kind of boogeyman, a generic label for anything dreadful that lurked just outside the warm, safe glow of the campfire. As the 20th century rolled on, the Wendigo eventually made its way from the written word to the flickering screen. It started showing up as a villain in horror comics, TV anthology series, and all kinds of low-budget horror films. It had become a go-to, public domain monster, perfect for stalking unsuspecting campers or unlucky travelers who wandered too far into the Canadian or American wilderness. In many of those early screen appearances, the Wendigo was portrayed much like it was in Algernon Blackwood's original tale, an unseen or barely visible force, more of a presence than a creature you actually saw. Filmmakers, often working with tight budgets, relied on creepy shadows, eerie sounds, and frantic point-of-view shots to build suspense and fear, leaving the monster's appearance up to the viewer's imagination. The Wendigo's visibility got a major boost when it appeared as the ancient evil that tainted the cursed land in Stephen King's wildly popular novel Pet Sematary and its film adaptations. In that version, the Wendigo wasn't something you could physically fight. It was a kind of spiritual contamination, a dark force that poisoned the land and pushed people toward madness and horrifying acts. This exposed the name and concept of the Wendigo to millions of readers and viewers, solidifying its spot in modern horror lore. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, a very specific visual image of the Wendigo started popping up in pop culture, an image that had almost nothing to do with traditional Algonquian folklore. This version showed the Wendigo as a humanoid creature with the skull of a deer or elk for a head, usually with a huge rack of antlers. That striking design, mixing a human-like body with the look of a wild forest animal, was popularized by independent horror films and then spread widely thanks to a new wave of digital artists online. The creepy, horned look was visually terrifying, easy to remember, and had a kind of dark, forest pagan vibe that artists and fans loved. It looked so cool and scary that it quickly became the go-to version of the Wendigo across nearly every media format. It started showing up in TV shows, comic books, and, most notably, in video games, where its unique silhouette made it the perfect nightmare fuel. The deer skull Wendigo wasn't just one take anymore. It had become the default at that point. The transformation was just about complete. The original folkloric version of the Wendigo, a giant monster that still looked human, and whose horror came from its loss of humanity, was almost completely replaced by this newer, more visually intense beast. Now, it was more animal than man. Maybe no single piece of modern media did more to solidify the Wendigo's place in the public imagination than the 2015 survival horror video game Until Dawn. The setup was classic horror. A bunch of teens stranded in a remote mountain lodge with a dark past, forced to survive the night while being hunted by terrifying creatures. But the game's developers had done their homework. They skillfully built the real core of the Wendigo legend into the storyline. In the game, the mountain itself is cursed, and the monsters hunting the characters were once miners who got trapped underground in a cave in years earlier. To stay alive, they turned to cannibalism, and by doing so, they became possessed by the mountain's ancient spirit, transforming into Wendigos. Still, the Wendigo's design in Until Dawn was completely modern. This wasn't the lipless, emaciated giant from old folklore. It also wasn't the deer skull monster from internet art. The Wendigos in the game were fast, shrieking, blind creatures that moved like insects, pale, hairless, humanoid predators built perfectly for jump scares and heart-pounding chase scenes in a game setting. For millions of gamers, Until Dawn was their first real introduction to the Wendigo. The game was a massive hit, and its genius combination of an authentic mythological backstory, the curse of cannibalism, with a brand new terrifying visual look, created the most recognizable and widely known version of the monster for a whole new generation. And just like that, the Wendigo's long journey from a culturally specific spirit to a global pop culture monster was complete. It had been reimagined by missionaries, recorded by anthropologists, reinterpreted by horror writers, and redesigned entirely by filmmakers, artists, and game developers. With every step, it moved further and further away from where it started. But in this long game of cultural reinterpretation, a lot of the original meaning got lost. The real Wendigo was never just a monster. It was a complex, symbolic story about the human condition, a warning about greed, our spiritual connection to nature, and how fragile the mind can be when pushed to survive. The Wendigo was something you became. Most modern versions, though, are way simpler. The Wendigo is now just a physical beast to fight and kill. It's something you run into, not something you transform into. The heartbreaking, haunting story of a person losing their soul to hunger has been replaced by a cool-looking but shallow creature, stripped of its culture and robbed of its original terrifying purpose. The legend of the Wendigo starts with something brutally simple: the need for food in a world where food was hard to find. For the people living in the remote forests of the north, this wasn't just a story. It was a real threat they faced constantly. But for most of us today, that specific fear has faded away. So, why does this myth still hit us so hard? Why hasn't it vanished? Maybe it's because hunger itself has changed, but that deep, aching emptiness hasn't. The Wendigo legend is like a disturbing mirror. It shows us that any kind of hunger, when it becomes uncontrollable, can turn into something horrifying. It could be the hunger for food during a harsh winter, or the hunger for money, power, status, or even the non-stop flood of likes, clicks, and attention in today's world of excess. At its heart, the Wendigo is a warning about what happens when you keep consuming, but never feel full. A warning that a society, just like a person, that only takes and never thinks about balance or consequences can lose what makes it human. It can lose its warmth, its empathy, and its bond with the world around it. The Wendigo didn't disappear. It just moved into a much bigger, louder, and more modern forest. For the communities of the North, the line between being human and turning into a monster was clear. You never eat another person, no matter how desperate you are. Crossing that line meant you lost your soul. You didn't just do something wrong, you became something else. You became a vessel for a dark, unnatural hunger. It was a kind of spiritual sickness, a mental break that happened when you stopped seeing the world as a web of relationships and started seeing it as a pile of things to take. Indigenous thinkers today have given that sickness a name, Wetiko, and they're not using it for some monster in the woods. They use it to describe something bigger, the spiritual sickness at the heart of colonialism. The hunger for land, profit, power. A hunger so greedy that it wipes out entire cultures and ecosystems without ever feeling satisfied. In this view, the real Wendigo wasn't Swift Runner. He was just a man crushed by a world falling apart. The real Wendigo was the system that destroyed his world. A machine driven by endless hunger, one that devoured people, land, and meaning while ignoring the destruction it left behind. That means the Wendigo story isn't just an old myth. It's a diagnosis, a painfully accurate warning about the sickness running through modern life. And it forces us to ask, what happens when an entire society, not just one person, crosses that forbidden line? What happens when Wetiko becomes normal? Maybe we've been looking at the Wendigo story all wrong. Maybe it wasn't just a warning for people in the forest. Maybe it was a prophecy about a world that was on its way. A world ruled by a hunger far bigger than any individual could carry. The old stories said the Wendigo was born when people traded community for greed and started seeing nature as something to be used up. If that's true, then the Wendigo never left the woods. It just found new hosts, stronger ones. Its hunger spread from one starving family to entire nations and whole continents. The real horror of the Wendigo myth isn't that a monster used to wander the woods. The real horror is that the world it warned us about, the world built on endless taking, is the world we're living in now. This story isn't just some ancient echo. It's a diagnosis of a fever that's still burning. Thank you for walking through the cold, silent forests of the North with me and listening to the story of the Wendigo. My goal is to keep exploring stories like these, deep, complex, and often forgotten parts of our past. If that journey interests you, I'd be honored if you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what's coming next. And as always, thank you for your time and attention.